Thanks to everyone for coming out tonight for another version of the Morton-Kenney Lecture. I'm delighted that a friend and really wonderful man, Ira Shapiro, will be joining us. Ira has come from Washington via the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, and he's had a long travel day, so we really appreciate him making the effort to come. Just a word on the lecture series. As you may know, this series was established in 1995 by Dr. Jerry Malure to honor two of his favorite political science professors, Ward Morton and David Kenney. This series has included speeches in Carbondale by such luminaries as Jim Baker, Jim Edgar, George McGovern, Christine Todd Whitman, and Ted Sorensen. And I think Ira is a wonderful addition to this lecture tradition. Ira has had a wide-ranging and consequential career in Washington. He's worked as a staffer for 5 senators. He was served on 2 panels to vet vice presidential nominees. He was an American trade ambassador for a number of years in the Clinton administration and helped negotiate the NAFTA trade accord. He's an international lawyer and consultant now, and is the author of 2 really wonderful books, The Last Great Senate and Broken, Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? I met Ira in 2012. We were both kind of on the book circuit. I had written a book on Senator Lugar, and he had written his book, The Last Great Senate. And so we had some events together and became friends and kept in touch. And even when I met him back then, I said, God, I know this man somehow. And I had recalled that he had run for Congress. So I look back, and in 2002, he ran this really widely acclaimed campaign, sort of Mr. Smith comes to Washington and tries to go to Washington in terms of substantive and idealistic and hopeful and confident. And the last week I went back to the Washington Post to read a little bit about the campaign. And he actually was challenging 2 very formidable people, Mark Shriver from the Kennedy family, and then Chris Van Hollen, who was then a state senator and is now a U.S. senator from Maryland. But Ira ran this very idealistic campaign, and one of the things I recalled was that he had written for himself a memo called Rules of the Road, which he wanted to refer to as the campaign unfolded, and you sort of wonder, why did I get myself into this in the first place? And as I was looking at the rules of the road, it occurred to me that Paul Simon could have written some of these. The first one is be willing to risk losing, but the worst thing is not to try. Another one was to stay positive, and actually you can compliment your opponents. You don't have to be critical of them, and if they say important things and make contributions to the campaign, you can actually applaud them, and it's not against the rules to do so. And the final one was just to have fun, because it's a great adventure and you've thought about doing it long enough, so time to buckle up and give it a go. So hopefully tonight Ira will be able to give us some of the rules of the road to think about the world that we're in, the leadership crisis we face, I think both in Washington and Springfield, and some of the requirements of us as citizens to force our leaders to make good decisions and to support them when they make hard decisions. So with that, let me turn it over to Ira Shapiro.
Thank you, John. That was truly a wonderful introduction. To be honest, I ran for Congress in 2002. I didn't remember any of the rules of the road. But I do remember the race, vaguely. People said to me afterward, when I had been defeated, how could you possibly run against Mark Kennedy Shriver and Chris Van Hollen? And I said, well, this is more than a technical point, but actually they ran against me, since I declared first. And when they heard me campaigning, they said, oh, this must be worth doing. So they got into the race after that. I always enjoy being introduced and thinking about my career. It's a career that I would describe best as long at this point, and diverse and long. And I will confess at the outset, so there's no confusion, there won't be confusion for too long, I am a Democrat. and that'll probably become obvious at some point. But being a Democrat, that means I've worked for candidates who have been defeated in landslides. George McGovern, one state. Walter Mondale, one state. I've worked for candidates who have been defeated narrowly, like Al Gore. I've worked for some candidates that have won. I've lost my own campaign. And I'm sort of reminded sometimes when I look back on it, Winston Churchill is supposed to have said, "Success is the ability to move from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm." And frequently, that's the way I feel. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to join the list of speakers that have given the Morton-Kenney Lectures. There's some very distinguished people on the list, and I'm delighted to be part of that. And I want to thank John for the invitation. John and I became close friends in 2012. He's a wonderful journalist and a wonderful author, very knowledgeable about Washington and American politics broadly. He would be a great Morton-Kenney lecturer, but fortunately he had to find an outsider. So I really appreciate it to be here. It also means a lot for me to be at an institute named for Senator Simon. In my long career, in 1985, in January, I was Jay Rockefeller's first chief of staff in the Senate, when a group of new senators came in to replenish the Democratic bench, which had been decimated a few years earlier. And in that group was John Kerry of Massachusetts, Al Gore of Tennessee, Tom Harkin of Iowa, Jay Rockefeller, and Paul Simon. It was a very distinguished group of people. And I remember, as many of you do, Senator Simon, this crusading journalist who turned great public servant. And I'll always think of him at the typewriter with his bow tie, communicating with the people of Illinois and the people of the United States. He was an extraordinary person, and he kind of epitomized the quality of statesman, politician-statesman that we used to have, and oftentimes don't seem to have anymore. I have to say, just to locate myself on the spectrum, I was born in New York and grew up in New York City and grew up on Long Island. I was educated on the East and West coasts. But I actually have a lot of Midwest ties. And most of the people who inspired my career at different times were from the Midwest. I worked with Ab Mikva of Illinois when he first got to Congress, and I helped him in his congressional campaign. Then there was the McGovern campaign. Walter Mondale was a 40-year friend. Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin brought me to the Senate. Jay Rockefeller and Robert Byrd were from West Virginia. And so I feel like, to the extent that one needs to come to the heartland, get out of Washington, get away from the coast, a lot of the things that I think of as the best in politics, I inherited from some of these people in the Midwest. Now, speakers occasionally get lucky. Because of the intense focus on the Kavanagh nomination this week, the Senate is at center stage. I probably don't have to convince you that the Senate is important. I probably don't have to convince you that the Senate is broken, bitterly partisan and torn apart for a long period of time. One of my cardinal rules about speaking is never speak more than 20 or 25 minutes. I might ask for a slight exception to the rule this time. I might ask for a few more minutes because there's a lot going on. There was once a former senator and a noted orator named Chauncey Depew and he was very famous at the time, and he gave a lot of speeches. He was once asked if it bothered him when someone in the audience would look at their watch, and he said, no, unless they start shaking them. So I'll try to finish before you start shaking your watches. My two books, and particularly my recent book, grew out of a long love of the United States Senate, going back now a half century. For me, as for many of my age, we grew up in the crisis times of the late 60s, with the Vietnam War, with violence in the cities, with assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King 50 years ago this year. And in those crisis times, the Senate, for many of us, was kind of a beacon of hope. It was a place where progressive legislation was somehow worked out and passed, where the Vietnam policy was questioned, and ultimately the war was brought to a conclusion, where Richard Nixon was held accountable for Watergate. The Senate seemed to have a close relationship to the Constitution. War and peace, civil rights, constitutional issues. I was fortunate enough to get a summer internship coming out of college with Jacob Javits of New York, Republican senator. And what I saw that summer inspired me and sort of shaped my career. In fact, one would say I haven't made much progress. I got hooked on the Senate 50 years ago, and I'm still talking about it. But the work of the Senate and the Senate staff, the way it functioned, gave me a vision how I might contribute to public service and maybe make a contribution to the country. And so I was determined to come back to the Senate. Gaylord Nelson, after I went to law school, Gaylord Nelson gave me the chance to come to the Senate in 1975. My first day was almost my last day. I was very excited to be there. So I went and I got all my credentials, which included the valuable Senate ID, by which I could get onto the Senate floor, which was pretty exciting. So I took the subway from the Russell Senate Office Building over to the Capitol. I'm sure some of you have ridden it at some point. And I walked into the empty Senate, showed my ID, walked into the empty Senate chamber. It was smaller and more intimate than I thought it would be. I looked at the senators' desks, and I found Senator Nelson's desk. Suddenly, inexplicably, I sat down at Senator Nelson's desk. Within a nanosecond, a huge hand clamped down on my shoulder. I looked up and saw an enormous man. He must have been 6'4" and 250 pounds. He looked down and saw an average-sized person. In the style of the day, I had an excess of hair at that time. "Hey, little buddy," he said, "are you a senator?" "No," I squeaked. "I just started working for Senator Nelson today." "Well," the big man said, "if you want to keep working for Senator Nelson, you'll get out of that desk, and you'll never sit in it again." And I thought that was a good plan. I spent 12 years in the Senate after that. There are people that were there longer and probably people that did more. But I had a unique experience. I was personal staff, committee staff, counsel to the majority leader. I ran a special committee. I worked on domestic and foreign policy issues, and I had, importantly, 5 years with the Democrats when they were in the majority, and then 6 more years when the Republicans took over after Ronald Reagan's election. So I saw it from both sides, the majority and the minority. And I learned how to stand on principle, and I learned how to compromise. And I wasn't the only person of that sort. At that time, the Senate drew people to Washington. I didn't know them all at the time, but running around at the same time on Capitol Hill were Tom Daschle, Lamar Alexander. Mitch McConnell was there. I'll get back to him. Susan Collins came a few years later. She was a little younger, but she came at the same time. Stephen Breyer, before he went on the Supreme Federal Court and became a Supreme Court justice. Madeleine Albright, before she was Secretary of State. A young man from Arkansas named Bill Clinton started his career there. You'll see the people on the news like Mark Shields, George Will, Chris Matthews. It was a place that drew us there because it was a place that inspired us because it worked at the time. So I left the Senate 30 years ago. And like so many people who had the privilege of working there, I watched its long decline with sadness. In 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, and that was a very exciting campaign, I started thinking about writing a book about the Senate when it was great, specifically when I was there. I wanted to remind people about those individual senators, but I also wanted to remind them what the Senate was like when it worked, when people worked together. When I started writing the book, I was hoping, it's about 2009 by then, I was hoping that the election would change our downward spiral of politics, that things would change because Obama was elected. I may have been naive, but I certainly was wrong. Of course, the exact opposite happened. By the time I completed the book, our politics and our gridlock had much worsened. By 2011, the Senate was mired in gridlock. And so I finished the book, didn't solve all the problems with the book, and our politics continued to get worse. Having not solved all those problems, I decided to return this year and write another book, which is a tougher book, more critical book, entitled Broken: Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? And the important thing about that book is I started writing it in the fall of 2016 when I was quite sure Secretary Clinton would be elected. And I didn't think she could govern unless the Senate worked better than it had. So my talk is going to be a little unusual in the sense that Donald Trump dominates our political landscape like no president perhaps ever has. But this is not primarily about Donald Trump. At some levels, I think we all understand that the crisis of American democracy didn't start with President Trump, didn't start with candidate Trump. I would argue that our political system has been like the proverbial frog in boiling water, slowly dying without noticing it for about 25 or 30 years. In my view, the Senate is ground zero for the failure. It's the institution that has failed us the longest and the worst, declining over a 25 or 30-year period. Now, why do I say that? Because at its best, the Senate was what Walter Mondale once called the nation's mediator. It was the place where the two parties came together to reconcile the diverse interests of our complex country, economic interests, regional interests, all kinds of diverse interests. They came together through extended debate on principled compromise. It was, in the memorable words of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, the Senate was the room where it happened. Once the Senate couldn't perform that function any longer, once it succumbed to partisanship rather than overcoming it, the system seized up and went into gridlock. The American people lost confidence in Washington. And why not, given the gridlock, given the bitter partisanship? Donald Trump would not have become president without being a unique celebrity. But he also wouldn't have become president without the failure of Washington. It opened the door to an outsider, and Donald Trump was able to walk through that door. Now, obviously, I'm painting with a broad brush. In a longer discussion, we would talk about the themes that animated the Trump campaign, particularly anger about immigration and the impact of trade and globalization. But when we're talking about the performance of the government, the Trump presidency, I would argue, is the result of the polarization, the gridlock, and the dysfunction. And the Senate failure is the cause. And more important now is that the Senate reached a new low at precisely the moment that we need a strong Senate, at precisely the moment when you need some strong institution to provide a political check on a president who may or may not be, depending on your viewpoint, may or may not be a danger to democracy, but a strong president following policies that could be described as radical departures from the past. It would be good if we had a Senate that functioned the way the Senate was supposed to. So I want to talk about how we got here a little bit, and that implies talking a little bit about leadership and the role that Senate leaders play, positive and negative, can play. And so looking back over history, you find times when Senate leaders make indelible marks on the period that they're living in and working in. And of course, the most famous example is Lyndon Johnson, the master of the Senate, according to Robert Caro. And Johnson did an extraordinary amount to take a reactionary Senate and pull it into the 20th century with his sheer force of will. And he was able to get through, as Caro documents, the first civil rights legislation, a modest bill, but an accomplishment. But Johnson wore out his welcome in the Senate rather quickly. Democrats were tired of the way he bullied them, and he jumped at the chance to become vice president to John Kennedy, largely because he thought it might be the path to the presidency. But also, he knew he had worn out his welcome in the Senate. The political historian Lewis Gould wrote, "For the Senate, Lyndon Johnson was a noisy summer storm that rattled the windows of the upper chamber and then moved on, leaving few traces of his passing. He seemed a towering figure at the time, but his essential lack of vision of the Senate limited his impact." So, could use some water. To understand the Senate and how it really worked at its best, you have to find your way to his successor, Mike Mansfield of Montana, not as well known as Johnson. But I discovered something when I wrote the book, The Last Great Senate. I'm proud of coining the term, the Great Senate, but in this book I refer to it differently as Mansfield's Senate. Mansfield was a professor of Asian history and a very unlikely politician. He was respected for his intellect and his honesty, but he had no desire to run the Senate. John Kennedy asked him, when elected president, John Kennedy asked him to be majority leader, and Mansfield said, "Not interested," but Kennedy implored him, and Mansfield did it. And he quickly made it clear that the Senate would be different under his leadership than it had been previously. He believed in a democratic, small d Senate, where all senators were adults, all elected, and all equal. And to a degree that stunned the senators, he treated them, thank you, he treated them, this is a very important person, he treated people equally, Democrats and Republicans. He treated them all well. He treated them the way he expected to be treated and lived by the golden rule. Many senators didn't think it could work, and the Senate quickly got paralyzed. Mansfield couldn't seem to move the Senate ahead, but at the time that John Kennedy was assassinated, Mansfield was preparing to tell the Senate his theory of leadership. He was ready to tell them that this was the way he was going to lead, and if they didn't like it, they could replace him. He never got to give that speech, but he put it in the record. And Mansfield and the Senate rose to the challenge of history after President Kennedy's death. He demonstrated his leadership and character early on. Lyndon Johnson, the new president, said to him, "We got to do this civil rights legislation. And the way to do it is you wear out the Southerners. They're not healthy, they're old. Ellender's got cancer, Richard Russell's old. You wear them down." And Mansfield said, "I'm not going to do it that way." And he went to Russell, the leader of the Southerners, and he said, we're going to debate this at great length. I'm going to try to beat your filibuster. There'll be no games. And there was a 2-month debate that lifted the nation and ultimately led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and following that to the most progressive and accomplished era of the Senate that went on from Mansfield. The Senate was no longer a graveyard of progressive dreams. So why did it work? Why did it work? Mansfield created a Senate based on trust and mutual respect. Bipartisanship was second nature. Everyone who worked there knew. You had an idea, if you were a Democrat, find a Republican. The senators could fight over issues, then they'd go out to dinner together. The rights of individual senators were respected, but everyone knew collective action was what they were there for. They were supposed to take action. They weren't supposed to be paralyzed. Filibusters were rare, real but rare. Holds were temporary. So Mansfield also said, he reminded people that the individual agendas didn't matter. It was the Senate, the rock of the Republic, that mattered. And they all came to the view that they were there for the national interest. They represented their states, of course. The Democrats and the Republicans had different views, but they had an overriding national interest. John McCain's great phrase, country first. They believed it. They actually acted that way. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. They debated vigorously, then they went out to dinner. But they knew why they were there. They were there for the country. And Mansfield, after he left, he was succeeded by 2 other men who were the same way. Howard Baker, Republican from Tennessee, famous for asking the great question, and during Watergate, what did the president know and when did he know it? Robert Byrd of West Virginia, self-educated, a former Ku Klux Klan member who became one of the great Senate leaders of all time and kept on growing. So these people knew how to be senators and they knew how to be Senate leaders. There was a time when Howard Baker had just become minority leader. Jimmy Carter was the new president. Carter tells Baker he's going to negotiate a new Panama Canal Treaty. Very controversial. 5 presidents have ducked it. The Republicans all hate the idea. Baker recalls his reaction. Why now? Why me? His staff says to him, Senator, if you do this and you support it, you'll never be able to get the Republican nomination. Baker says, I'm the Senate leader. I'm going to study it and see what the country needs, and I'll do what the country needs. He supports the treaty. It narrowly succeeds as treaty. He never becomes president, but we remember him as a great leader. So what happened? What happened to that Senate? I would say that if you looked over a long period of time, starting in the late 80s, maybe the early 90s, the Senate becomes increasingly unable to overcome the centrifugal forces that are pulling people apart. Times are getting more partisan. By 2005, one of the Senate historians Lewis Gould, says a profound sense of crisis now surrounds the Senate and its members. By coincidence, so there's this long decline. Politics are getting more difficult, more divided. Parties are all moving apart. And by coincidence, in 2005, the Senate gets a new leader, Harry Reid of Nevada. 2 years later, they get another leader, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. These are veteran senators. They've both been there 20 years. They've worked their way up the ladder. You think maybe they have the experience, the obligation, and the opportunity to address the decline and rebuild the Senate. Instead, they become, in the words of journalist Stephen Collinson, the terrible twins of dysfunction in a gridlock Senate, both using arcane procedures to slow and throttle each other's rule. Their supporters would argue over the years who was worse, never who was better. Under their leadership, excuse me. Under their leadership, the gradual decline turns into a deep dive. Their joint legacy would be a broken Senate, and the responsibility was by no means equal. Obviously not since Reid retired, but not when he was there first. In my view, it's no accident that the Senate's accelerating descent absolutely coincides with Mitch McConnell's time as leader. Now, take one drink. My wife always says, don't start in too early on McConnell. So I've gone a few minutes. I've probably gone my 20 minutes, and so I haven't gotten to McConnell yet. So, because this is about leadership, and Mansfield and Byrd and Baker had qualities of leadership that made a great deal of difference in the country, and a lot of senators who worked with them had similar qualities, and they all worked together. So, McConnell, historians always debate the impact of individuals as opposed to larger forces at work. And of course, there are many factors that have contributed to the deterioration of our politics. The parties really are further apart than they used to be. The effect of money in politics has been terribly corrosive, particularly since the Citizens United case. We have the 24/7 media, and increasingly a political debate that occurs on the internet and through Twitter. We have people picking their own news sources, which reinforce their own views. And eventually, we have the weaponized social media. And in America, over the last 30 years, our politics have been undermined by a combination of factors that have been referred to by two phrases: the permanent campaign, whereby there's never time for governing. You just campaign, and then you set up the issues for the next campaign. No time for governing. And the politics of personal destruction, where the best minds in politics are devoted to negative ads, negative messaging, destroying their opponents. We usually identify that with Newt Gingrich. He sort of started it, but the permanent campaign and the politics of personal destruction. And Senator McConnell's defenders would say that, look, he's just an effective partisan. One of his defenders said, look, Mitch is no Bob Dole, but these are different times. For me, that argument doesn't really wash. I think they're different times in part because he's made them different times. From my standpoint, the foremost requirements of leaders are to build trust and mutual respect, to make institutions work the way they're supposed to work, to deal honestly and openly with people, And I think that he has failed on virtually all of those levels. Now, I want to be clear, which is one of the disturbing points here. I see Senator McConnell as the premier political strategist and tactician of our time. I think he's also the toughest negotiator. I think he's been extraordinarily effective of what he's accomplished. But the problem is he's never been a Senate leader. He's been the Republican leader in the Senate. Senate leaders are supposed to make the place work. They're supposed to work with the other party. They're supposed to work with the president, even if the president happens to be a Democrat. Now, by now we all know certain things that Senator McConnell has done, and most particularly we remember the blocking of the nomination of Merrick Garland, Judge Garland, so that President Obama was not able to nominate someone who would even be considered for the Supreme Court at that point. And we remember that, but there were many other cases that were quite similar throughout the Obama years. And one of the things that I found most disturbing is that in the financial crisis, the Lehman crisis of 2008, McConnell understood, this was when George W. Bush was still president, McConnell understood that Congress needed to act, even though it was unpopular, to create the so-called TARP legislation, to keep the financial system afloat. He acted as a leader. He acted forcefully. His memoir showed he was very proud of the leadership he provided. 3 months later, the country was still in crisis. 750,000 jobs were lost in 1 month, January 2009. But there was a new president who was Democratic. And so McConnell turned to complete opposition. He tried very hard to kill and to defeat the economic stimulus that was needed to start the economy moving again. There is no other leader, in my experience, that would have done that. Howard Baker or Bob Dole would have said to their troops, they're going to disagree with Obama on a lot of things, but right now we got to save the economy. McConnell's memoir makes it quite clear that the only thing he was concerned about at the time was Obama's high approval ratings, not the 750,000 people losing jobs. So that was kind of a disgrace. He was a constant obstructionist to Obama's presidency for 6 years. In the 7th year, he became majority leader. Mysteriously, the Senate started working. All of a sudden, it started churning out bipartisan legislation. Wasn't that complicated? The principal obstructionist had become a constructive player. It changed like that. The senators actually have the ability to make the Senate work. It's just that they hadn't had the opportunity before. That comeback lasted 1 year and 1 month. Then Justice Scalia died. McConnell essentially sacrificed the Senate in order to paralyze the process so that there would be no Supreme Court nominee. So then we get into 2017. Now he has a Republican president. He's given great speeches about how the Senate's supposed to work, regular order, bipartisanship, etc. But once in the majority, the obstructionist becomes a steamroller. So you remember what he tried to do to repeal the Affordable Care Act with 50 votes, with no committee consideration, with no amendments. Unprecedented stuff. So I want to be clear about something because I am a Democrat. I've worked with a lot of Republicans. I was soft on the Republicans for years. All the ones that came when I was there were moderates, respected conservatives. The first 2 years two Congresses I was there, the people that came in were John Danforth, John Chafee, John Warner, John Hines. There are some people not named John, Nancy Kassenbaum, William Cohen, Al Simpson, great people. So part of the story, if you're being objective, is that the Republican Party changed over time. We all know that it's changed over time. And some of those people who found a home in the Republican Party haven't been comfortable for a long time. But I worked with a lot of Republicans, and I worked with 4 Republican administrations. McConnell is different, basically. And I'm not talking about policy differences, because policy differences are the stuff of politics. That's what we do. There's a left of center party, there's a right of center party. You fight about things, you try to work them out, then you have an election. Our system, at its best, finds ways to bring together the majority and the minority. But that's not the way McConnell views it. When challenged about the lack of considered debate, he said recently, people always argue about process when they're losing. At other times, he likes to say, winners make policy and losers go home. That's true of individuals, but there's always a minority party, and they're supposed to work together. And so I'm talking not about policy differences, I'm talking about attitudes that destroy institutions. And it's no accident that the Senate has reached a new low under his leadership. So we remember when John McCain came back to the Senate and cast that famous vote to block the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. But he also castigated tribal politics and reminded the senators not to focus just on winning. He went on to say incremental progress, compromise that each side criticizes but also accepts, and sometimes just plain muddling through, chipping away at problems. It's not glamorous or exciting, but it's sometimes the most we can expect of our system because we have a diverse and contentious society. So, I'll say one more thing about McConnell and then turn to the issue of the day. In his he wrote a memoir in 2016 called The Long Game. He devotes the first 5 pages of his memoir to a deeply personal statement. The Senate is the tool that has enabled us to find our footing almost every time. At its best, the Senate exists to stop the government from swinging between extremes as parties lose power, one loses power and another gains. People are not elected to the Senate to get everything they want. This is not an all or nothing place. And these are not the people we want to be leaders of the Senate or anything else. Well, by his own standards, he shouldn't be the leader of the Senate or anything else. And I've called him at different times the most destructive Senate leader and the other threat to American democracy. So, what about this Kavanagh nomination? Let me say, I opposed the Kavanagh nomination from the beginning. I opposed the Kavanagh nomination from before the beginning. I think that the last thing the United States needed was another Federalist Society judge. That's my personal view. I opposed the nomination for the same reason they made the nomination. The stated purpose, and I give Trump and McConnell credit for this, the stated purpose of that nomination was to move the Supreme Court substantially to the right. They said, we'll lock in a majority for the next 30 years. I think that's an unfortunate way to move the Supreme Court. Interestingly, in the Federalist Society, the interesting thing is that the Federalist Society has been working for a long time to overcome the fact that too many justices appointed by Republican presidents were, in their judgment, too moderate. They didn't like Sandra Day O'Connor. They didn't like Anthony Kennedy. They didn't like Souter. They didn't like Stevens. They didn't like any of them. At one time, Republican presidents appointed 10 consecutive justices that were confirmed by the Senate, and the Federalist Society wasn't satisfied with any of them. So they have been more effective at picking justices since then, and for that reason, I think it is I think it is not good for the country to have, others can disagree, but I think long before these allegations came to the surface, the question of whether another right-wing justice would be a good idea for the country when we're so closely divided anyway is a very fundamental question. And I would debate it at great length, except I've already gone on for great length. So every morning, I sit with my wife, read the newspapers. I express optimism about the future, that the Senate is going to play a great role despite McConnell. And she says, I don't know what you're talking about. What is the basis for this optimism? And I tell her the basis for the optimism. They hate the institution they're in. They actually understand that it's not what it's supposed to be. They're committed at some point to making it better. She says, all right, when is that going to happen? I said, well, it's going to happen when Special Counsel Mueller reports. I believe the Senate's ultimate challenge at this moment is protecting the Mueller investigation, making sure it runs to its completion, and then, if it does, helping provide the political judgment to assess the importance of it. I think that's what they'll be judged on. But I also think that the Kavanagh nomination comes along at an extraordinary moment. It wasn't anticipated, but I do believe that that will also be something that the Senate will have to be judged on. I've been hard on Leader McConnell, and I'm hard on the leaders generally. I'm hard on the followers, too. I think they should have done something to change the Senate by now. It's not impossible to change the Senate rules and to change the way it works. It's not impossible for the committees to push back and assert their jurisdiction. They shouldn't be going along with a Senate that they know is broken. So these are perilous times, in my opinion. We're either in the worst crisis since Vietnam 50 years ago, since the Civil War 150 years ago, or since the crisis the founders feared of an authoritarian president, potentially, 230 years ago. And I think that everyone, and by that I mean our leaders and we as citizens, have to kind of step up in a way that we're challenged to do. I have believed that Trump and McConnell would either cause the destruction of our democracy or its resurgence. And I'm hoping that the activity level of citizens across the country will constitute that resurgence. I thank you for letting me speak today, and I apologize for the length of my speech. It went much longer than I thought. Thank you. And I'm told that despite how long I spoke, I can take some questions. So I'll look out, and there's a question.
Yeah, you mentioned that some rule changes. Oh, excuse me. My name is Ben Begley, by the way. You mentioned some rule changes in the Senate may be able to restore them to greatness, perhaps. Is there going to be a few tweaks in the rules, or is there going to need to be wholesale change?
Well, look, my view basically is that there's been no real review of the rules since 1979. Filibusters have become very frequent, but it's not even filibusters. They're the threat of filibusters. Holds, so-called holds, which used to be temporary courtesies, have become indefinite holds for any reason or no reason at all. The president, this president and other presidents have been frustrated that nominations have taken a long time to be considered. I think there are things that you could change and make the rules better, but it would require doing it for the future. Nobody's going to agree to anything that applies next week, but you could make rules changes, systematic, serious rules changes that would apply to the next president or after the next presidential election. I don't think it's all a rules problem by any means. I think our politics are difficult for many reasons that we all understand, but the rules could be a lot better. And one thing you can't have is a set of rules that says, well, your legislative priorities require 60 votes, but mine require 50. That doesn't work. That's an abusive process.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the presentation.
By the way, I was going to say, I'm a former international trade negotiator, and I often used to talk about trade. But I actually think the threat to the democracy is more serious. But go ahead.
I actually wrote a very short article on NAFTA more than 25 years ago. Isn't it more likely than not, maybe, that the U.S. Senate's going to wind up looking more like the U.S. House, just as the U.S. House has become to look more like European parliaments because the centralization of power on the one hand in the central government and its effectiveness is going to make these partisan divisions more aggressive and more intense over time, precisely because the stakes have become higher. Thank you.
Yes. Everyone heard that question? I mean, look, I happen to like the concept of the way the Senate was supposed to work, that having an institution that actually brought the parties together and forced them to work together was helpful. If we're going to move away from that, I think we should move away from that with people in the Senate and people outside the Senate actually weighing in about what kind of system we want. I think right now we're sort of on a downward spiral to nowhere. So because of the way McConnell has run the Senate, it is true that if the Democrats got in control of the Senate, they might try to run it the same way. And I don't think that's the best way for the country. Because if you're slamming through legislation, you know, we got 50 votes plus the vice president, it never has the public support that it needs to be stable. The Affordable Care Act, McConnell deprived it of any possible support. If you read his memoir, it's quite clear that Obama reached out to a lot of the Republicans and McConnell talked them out of cooperating. The idea that you should have had 60 votes, the idea that we could have worked together on something, that we would try to put something in place the way we used to do it, that was what I called for at that time. So whatever system we have, it ought to be discussed, debated, and agreed upon.
To what do you account for people leaving the Senate, such as the moderates like Jeff Flake, Corker out of Tennessee? Why do people feel it seems to me like they're afraid of Trump or that, like it's political suicide, so people leave the Senate and don't like...
Well, look, I think each case is a little bit different. Flake is a person of conscience who spoke out against Trump and would undoubtedly have lost the Republican primary, no question. Interesting question whether, if he was interested, maybe he should have run as an independent in Arizona. But that's his decision. Corker has told me and told others he never planned to stay more than 12 years. He invokes the citizen legislator method, a model that Tennessee sometimes has. I think it's kind of an odd deal to sort of walk away from the job after the 12 years at where the world is now, but that's his thing. But the real question, look, there's no doubt that a lot of the Republican senators particularly are fearful of going against the president and are fearful of primary attacks from the right. I think that the difficulty is that if you just just go along with things that you don't really agree with because you're afraid of challenging it, because you're afraid of being primaried, then you're not going to make much of a contribution. I sort of liked what Lisa Murkowski did back in 2010. She lost her primary to somebody from the Tea Party, and she said, I'm not going to accept that. She ran a write-in campaign and got elected statewide. I think you have to stand, if you feel like you disagree and you want to have an independent view, I think you have to be willing to do it. You know, it's a difference. It shouldn't be just about staying in office. I mean, too many of them feel the need to stay in office at all costs. And that's not just primaries necessarily. I'm a fan, or used to be a fan, of Dianne Feinstein. I've known her career over the years. I think it's a disgrace that she's running for office again at the age of 85. I mean, these people who think somehow that they can't live without the Senate and the Senate can't live without them, it's just ridiculous. They're not making it work. They shouldn't be there. And they should have the common sense to know that they shouldn't be there. That can't be the last question. Yes, it's not.
I'd like you to comment on this. I suggest that Trump and McConnell are the effect rather than the cause, that except for the elites on the East Coast and West Coast, we have coal miners and steel workers and the Iron Range workers and such has been left behind, and they're just tired of it, and so that they have Mr. Trump.
Everyone hear that? No, look, there's no doubt, and I spent a lot of time years ago, but not recently. I spent a lot of time in West Virginia because I was Rockefeller's first chief of staff, and before that I worked for Senator Byrd. And there's no doubt that there are areas of the country in those states and other states, you know, where people feel that they've been left behind and not respected and not listened to by coastal elites. There's no question about it. And that's a big failure of the Democratic Party, probably a big failure of both parties, because I don't think the Republicans prior to Trump were listening to those people. But it's a big failure of the Democratic Party. And Secretary Clinton, for whatever other talent she had, was not addressing any of those issues and paid the price for it.
Of late, I've wondered if the Democratic Party could be of benefit if they restarted something like the Civilian Conservation Corps, only for a modern audience. If they actually had a development plan akin to that, do you think something like that would succeed in their chances and rebuild the nation?
I was missing parts of that. Did everyone hear it? I got the gist of it. It was a question about whether the Democrats could regain support by committing to something like the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I think, look, I think we have enormous unmet needs, infrastructure needs particularly. Everybody knows that we have them, and yet somehow we can't seem to reach an agreement on how to move ahead with it. I certainly think that there are things that could be done that would earn that kind of support, but it would also require, some recognition that a positive government role is something good, and the government has sacrificed a lot of credibility over time.
Ira, could you name 2 or 3 people in American politics now that you admire, find encouraging, hopeful?
I'm going to drink until I think of someone.
By 9 o'clock.
Look, I think there are some very able people in Washington. I think Senator Coons and Senator Reid, there are any number of promising young people. I think there are some very successful governors across the country, and mayors as well. I think if you get outside of Washington, there is more of a disposition to solving problems, although the partisanship that has poisoned Washington is also poisoning state capitals, too, many of them. I think I was trying to figure out, it's like the Peter, Paul, and Mary song, where have all the leaders gone? Trying to figure out why we don't have the kind of leaders that we've had in the past, and I think the partisanship is part of it, and the destructive nature of the politics is part of it. I also think that we have an massively overbuilt financial sector that has sucked up a lot of the talent in the country. And, the financial sector used to exist to fund the real economy. Now it exists for itself, by and large. And too many people that are talented have gone into it, and they've probably gotten very wealthy, but they haven't used their talents in the ways that benefit the country. If you think about it, think about 2 people who have been massively successful as businessmen and made fortunes, Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg. They didn't become great men until they started doing something beyond their businesses. So Bill Gates and Bill and Melinda Gates are doing an extraordinary amount of good around the world. And Michael Bloomberg has done a phenomenal job on many issues as well. It has to be about something bigger than making money. And somewhere along the line, particularly in the 80s and 90s, our country changed, and too many people focused on just money. Light's getting...
So you mentioned the importance of going out to dinner and presumably other social obligations to having good relationships with other senators on the other side of the aisle. And so I was wondering if there's any barriers, like the one I'd probably think of immediately would be fundraising, the amount of time spent fundraising that's stopping current members of the Senate from developing those relationships or being able to have better friendships with their colleagues across the aisle.
Yes, it's a good question. I think certainly, while a lot of people focus on the potential corrupting effect of money, it's also a real time suck. So people are spending too much time raising money and running around to raise the money. One senator who has actually become working very hard to bring people together is actually Mark Warner of Virginia, in part because he believes in it, but he's also able to do it because he's wealthy and he's local. And so he hosts a lot of dinners, He brings a lot of people together, and he's been effective in that regard. And it's certainly true that Tom Daschle used to say that travel, basically air travel, had done a lot of damage to senators. They're always off flying somewhere or another. But, even when you acknowledge all the problems, they could still do better. They kind of know it. Like, they know that when they have their weekly lunches, they're separate and they're partisan pep rallies. And so during the health care debate in 2017, the weekly Republican lunch became 3 times a week. Then it became daily. Well, if they don't like it, and they didn't like it, they thought it was excessive, why don't they push back? They don't have to spend that time together. I have no sympathy for these 98 senators who are not leaders, who basically go around talking about how the system is broken and never change anything.
Great job, Ira. Thank you. Too long. No, you didn't. Well, I just want to briefly thank Ira for giving us his time, his energy, his wisdom, his voice. I guess this would not be a great time to announce Mitch McConnell as the next Morton-Kenney speaker. That will be Tobin's call. But no, thank you for an interesting and wide-ranging remarks. And Ira will be around for a few minutes as we walks out of the room, so if you have any additional questions. And before you head back to Washington, we'd like to give you a book that my colleague John Jackson compiled of some of the great writings from Paul Simon. And I think reading this will give you a new burst of hope for our democracy. And maybe you can spread it around Washington as best you can. So thank you so much, Ira.